Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you every week. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me from his home in Arlington, Virginia is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kabbalah Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Ndugu Paul.
How are you?
I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans have insisted, an awesome son of Mother Africa.
Shaka, let's start in the West African nation of Mali, where we have a new regime in town. I'm talking about a new president, Bah Ndaw, the vice president, Goita, one of the former coup leaders, and we also have a prime minister who was sworn in over the weekend. Let's start there.
Yeah, Mali, of course, Ndugu Paul, is a very interesting country, especially when you look at it historically. It is a country where some of the perhaps greatest African civilizations, in fact, took root. When you talk about higher education, you talk about higher learning, universities, you are told somehow that it was in Timbuktu. It was Timbuktu, which was a great learning center, where, as a matter of fact, even some scholars from the rest of Africa and especially the Middle East would go on a pilgrimage to go and sit at the feet of great African or Malian professors in order to get to understand their neighborhood and beyond.
Let me get your perspective on how we got here. Nearly a month ago, over a month ago, we had a totally different regime in place. We had Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta as the president of Mali. There were demonstrations almost on a daily basis for weeks. That led to a military coup, which was welcomed at home, but unfortunately not welcomed by the regional leaders, but the people, the ordinary people who had risen up, who, like you like to say, who had voted with their feet, rose up to the challenge and said, we are tired of this regime. Maybe bring us up to speed. What led to the events that we are talking about today?
I think clearly what led to those events was an election that was conducted under the former president, Mr. Ibrahim Keïta, an election that was disputed. And we are talking about parliamentary elections here. The election was disputed, and as a matter of fact, there was a request from the civil society and a lot of young people in Mali and a lot of other respectable groups that perhaps there should be a fresh election, an election that would meet at least the international standards of social, political, economic justice, an election that would meet at least the international standards or would meet the threshold of what is normally called democracy. And this was something that
as I was preparing for this show and doing my research, I came across very interesting information about both men at the helm of this country. The interim president, Mr. Bah Ndaw, is highly educated. He did military training both in the Soviet Union and in France. And so is his deputy. His deputy did military training here in the United States and in France. So it's an interesting combination. Both men are soldiers, and we are talking about a civilian leadership here. Am I missing something?
No, Ndaw in particular is very widely respected in Malian society, especially because as a professional soldier many years ago, he happened to be serving as an aide de camp, an ADC, to a leader of a junta, General Traore, who had carried out successful military coup And those were the days, by the way, when coups were pretty much accepted as if, in fact, they were elections. They became so popular at one time in Africa to the extent that every colonel that woke up earlier than the other one would simply run to the only radio in the capital and announce that there has been a military coup. And it would actually be the beginning of a regime. But this is a man, when he was aide-de-camp to General Traore, did not like the manner in which General Traore's wife, the first lady, was interfering with state duties to the extent that he actually disagreed with the manner in which she was interfering with state duties and resigned. And from that time, he was incredibly admired by a lot of people in Malian society. He is very, very difficult to persuade so as to go somewhere else. I hope that he will find it very, very appropriate this time around in his new role to make sure that he thinks in terms of compromise. Because after all, when you talk about Mali, you're not talking about a military barracks. You're talking about a country whose majority are civilians, and civilians are a very free people. They do not go about their lives as if they were supposed to be taking orders or instructions in a barracks sort of setup.
Interesting. You just brought up a very interesting point. Let's look at coups, generally speaking, in terms of the African continent. As again, as I was doing research for this show, I came across some information that was done, some research that was done by two political scientists here, based here in the United States. One is called Jonathan Powell, and another one is called Clayton Theon. They wrote a very powerful analysis about African coups, and they say that since 1950s, in Africa alone, there's been a combined total of 206 coups. And they define a coup as attempts by the military or other people in the government to overthrow a legitimate, quote-unquote, legitimate government. But in your view, Shaka, what's a coup and why are these coups happening? What's leading people or young people to take up to the streets and ending up in a situation that we're talking about?
I think that what those researchers didn't explain was that beyond a military coup, which is normally led by senior military officers, followed by the soldiers under their command. And of course, there have been some exceptions where the non-commissioned officers have themselves, in fact, carried out successful coups, like one in Liberia, for example. It was carried out by a man called Master Sergeant Doe, who eventually promoted himself to general, and Dr. Doe to boot. Then you also have situations in Sierra Leone where a Lance Corporal, Fode Sanko, actually nearly overthrew the government. And he had a lot of following. So these coups generally come about largely because of social, economic, political injustice. They come up when the state can no longer protect people and property. They come up when the state cannot create an enabling environment for ordinary people to carry out with their life. They come up when sometimes they have elections which have been carried out, and most people tend not to agree with the result because they think that the results, in fact, are reflections of creative accounting as opposed to reflections of the will of the people or the will of the voter. I think that it is good, Paul, now that the international community has come to the conclusion that under no circumstances is the international community to continue doing business as usual with a government or a regime that has shot its way into power. When a group seizes power and gets itself into positions of authority, the government is virtually isolated, both regionally, continentally, and the entire international community. And because of that, it has in fact acted as a deterrent of sorts. That's why there are not as many coups as there used to be before. What dictators have learned, because dictators are very smart people, what they have learned now is not necessarily to use the AK-47 in order to hang on to power directly. What they do is conduct elections, which some people in fact regard as selections. These people who happen to be incumbent presidents cannot hold elections which they are willing to lose. And so what happens is they rig those elections, or sometimes they actually shift the political and constitutional goalposts so as to amend the constitution so that they can actually run or at least continue to be in power for as long as they can do, because otherwise they end up being a sort of presidential monarchs. There are other systems of governments where you don't have to worry about running for elections. If, for example, you are a king in a kingdom, if you are a monarch, if you are an emir, if you are a sultan, if you are a queen, you don't have to worry very much about running for elections because you are presiding upon a country where you are actually have subjects and not citizens. But in a republic such as Mali, and across most of the African continent, sincerely, perhaps with the exception of Morocco and a place like Eswatini,
Eritrea.
which Eritrea is like a sort of presidential monarch.
Yeah, he doesn't subject
but
himself to elections, and he's
yes. So Eritrea is a special case. It's like a presidential monarch. But I'm talking about some of these legitimate monarchies, like Morocco. The king does not subject himself to elections because he is a legitimate king of Morocco, and the constitution accepts that. If you are talking about Eswatini, the former kingdom of Swaziland, you also don't subject the king to an election because he's a legitimate king of Eswatini. But in situations where elections are stolen or are rigged, where results are reflections of creative accounting or reflections of the individual who announced the results on behalf of the incumbent dictator, somehow, for some reason, the international community has taken so long to accept the fact or to acknowledge the fact that that itself is a form of a coup, even though it is not a military coup. It is something, frankly, if you could go to an independent court, you could prove that you are talking about a group of people committing treason because they have in fact overthrown a lawful constitution of the republic.
You and I think we've talked about this so many times, and I'm not a lawyer, but any reasonable person would tell you that a constitution is a working document. Basically, you can change it anytime, if you will. It's up to you to reach out to the people either through a referendum or use your houses of parliament or senate, whatever it is, to change that constitution. To live up to maybe to the standards of your expectations.
Yes, you definitely make a point. There is no question that a constitution is a living document. And I have to acknowledge the fact that just like you, I am not in any way at all a qualified lawyer. I've never gone to any law school, but I have read some law. I've read some books that have guided me correctly to the extent that I can talk about some of those things in a manner that is reasonably intelligible. So what happens is that there are two ways, for example, why constitutions are amended or constitutions are changed. There are times when there is a legitimate reason why a constitution, in fact, should be amended or should be changed. That is no problem. Everybody should support that. But there are specific situations where specific incumbent presidents, for example, or leaders or prime ministers, change these constitutions or amend clauses in these constitutions for personal or political gain and not changing the constitution in the national interests.
But Shaka, politics is all about expediency.
Yes,
why shouldn't somebody take advantage of a document like that to favor themselves? Because at the end of the day, no matter how you look at it, whether it's here in the United States, whether it's in Europe, across the world, politicians take advantage of expediency.
Yes, but you are not a king. If you were a king, you definitely would have a right to do that. But if you are a president, mind you, as I said earlier, you are an employee of the people. It is the people that appoint you, that elect you and appoint you and trust you with that position. You are supposed to be discharging those duties on the behalf of the people who helped put you there. And because of that, there are rules of the game. There are situations like, for example, term limits. And there are other situations where the Constitution is open-ended. And in that particular case, so long as you have support, so long as you have people who would like you to continue leading them, you will continue leading them. But if you are an employee of somebody, Lugupol, you don't have the right, for example, to make decisions that are not acceptable to the individual or individuals or a group of people who gave you the job.
But
and so I think it is high time the international community, the regional economic groups like ECOWAS, like the African Union, for example, it's a high time they adopted a policy that is similar to distancing themselves from actions they consider to be an overthrow of a legitimate constitution, whether it is through military, as they do now, or whether it is through some other means which may be political, but in fact, which go through the efforts of the shifting of the political constitutional goalposts. So as an individual president, for example, to end up becoming a sort of presidential monarch.
Shaka, you just brought up a very good point. Let me go back to that. Why should people who are part of a club, for example, the African Union, ECOWAS, or the East African Community, or SADC for that matter, why should they go after their own leaders or people who are part of the same club who have legitimately gone to the people to seek for a referendum or to have constitutional amendments that allow them to extend their terms or to have periodic elections? And by the way, these leaders also subject themselves to periodic elections. So as far as they are concerned, everything is done legitimately.
It is very interesting that you raise that point because I have raised that point in the past to some senior officials of the African Union, but off the record. I have raised that point to some African senior diplomats, senior ambassadors representing different countries across the African continent. And the answer has always been that that can only happen when, for example, at least 50% of the 54 member countries of the African Union can actually become what you would consider to be democratic countries. When you talk about why should these individuals, probably who have the same circumstances in their own countries, and who also harbor some of these personal political interests, they obviously don't see any reason, whether it is legitimate or not. They don't see any reason why they should be sitting in a glass house and begin to throw political stones at other glass houses. But I think that with time, this is going to happen, especially with the changing demographics. When you look at the changing demographics, Paul, most of the African countries are in fact having a situation where the young people are increasingly becoming the majority. And these young people are not invested in the status quo. They have no jobs, they have no quality education, they have no room to maneuver, they have no hope even for tomorrow. And so I think what is going to happen is that the changing demographics in tandem with social media, the sort of media that gives them the power of exposure, it exposes them to a lot of things. That combination, I think, in time, is going to empower the young or the youth of Africa to actually begin advocating and struggling for change, because it is the only thing, frankly, that would reflect their interests and their concerns. And by the way, when you talk about change, the last time I checked, the only constant is change. Because whether you like it or not, society is not static. Society is dynamic. In Africa, you are also beginning to see that happening in some regions. When you go to West Africa, for example, under the ECOWAS, you see that democracy is gaining a foothold to the extent that even the land of the great ogres, the most populous nation on the African continent, Nigeria, now people are reasonably confident that their election, their vote can in fact count. You have Ghana. Ghana has now become a legitimate democratic player. You have Benin. You have Liberia. You have several countries that have embraced democracy. You go
Sierra
to
Leone.
SADC.
Yeah.
You have Sierra Leone. There are so many countries in Ndugu.
And these are all countries that have had their own share of coups.
Some of them had very, very many military coups. And when you go to the Southern African Development Community countries or SADC, you have the same story.
Let's go to a comment here. What do you make of some critics who say, for example, that the intellectual balance of power has been shifting in our favor? I mean, Africa's young people, their favor. And that if you look at all these coups that have been taking place, it's young people rising up to take on the establishment, to take on their leaders, because the leaders are not listening to them. Can this be business as usual? Can these leaders continue to be oblivious to what's happening on the ground.
I think that their worldview is different from the younger generation. I think that their exposure is different. When you look at those of us, for example, who belong to the generation of what I call the beneficiaries of the Gutenberg factor, the printing press, I think it is time for us to hand over the baton to the younger generation that interacts with social media, that is very good on Facebook, on Twitter, YouTube, and you name it. Because this is a totally new ball game. And you know, whether you like it or not, as I said a little bit earlier, the only thing that you cannot stop is change. As a matter of fact, a great French philosopher, intellectual, Victor Hugo, once said that it is an idea whose time has come. And the reason is very simple. It is because whether you like it or not, change is the only constant.
I've had an opportunity to travel across Africa. You've had an opportunity to do the same thing. When we talk to young people all over the continent, they tell us they want the same things. They aspire for the same things. But unfortunately, like again you pointed out, you said your generation is not giving us that opportunity. What does it take for you guys to look up to us or to groom us and say, hey, I'm handing you this baton? Because I think the biggest challenge that we have is leaders who have been telling us, people of your generation have been telling us that you guys, you're the future leaders of tomorrow. I remember as a kid listening to so many people, so many leaders are saying that you kids are the future leaders of tomorrow. So what is it going to take for you guys to say, maybe it's about time, here, we hand you over the baton?
That is very unlikely to happen. If you look at the history of power, the oppressor has never voluntarily, has never given or shared the power on his own volition. It has always had to take the underdog. It has always have to take the oppressed, to demand, and if necessary, to take the power. Because power is never going to come to you on a silver platter. You are going to have to, first of all, you are going to have to be able to become socially and politically conscious. You're going to have to identify what your rights are and begin to know how to organize yourself, to mobilize, organize, and assert your rights. That is the only way you can assure peace and stability in any country. Peace and stability is not necessarily the absence of war and violence. Rather, it is the presence of social, economic, political justice for all.
Yes, that's a good way to wrap up. And thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time.
You're most welcome, Ndiho.
Until then, so long from Washington.